800 years ago, Joy Boy tragically died, and his straw hat was passed on to someone else to inherit his will and legacy. Eventually, that dude also died and passed the hat on to a new dude who also died and passed it on to a third dude, and then approximately 35 to 40 dudes later, it was given to Goldie Roger. Who gave Roger the straw hat? Why did Roger know a hell of a lot more about the truth of the world at the start of his journey than even we as readers know right now? And just how many Joy people have there been throughout history that Oda has been hinting at in the manga this whole time? This video was inspired by a discussion by Joygo, who asked this fascinating question and pointed out a couple of very interesting things about Roger that somehow have flown completely under the radar of the Western One Piece fanbase. So there will be a link to that video in the description, but let's start with the premise of mentorship. Luffy's mentor was Shanks, Shanks' mentor was Roger, and Roger's mentor was, well, we don't know. However, we do know that he has inherited will from someone for two reasons. Reason number the first. It has been recently confirmed that Joy Boy 800 years ago wore the straw hat, and it is very likely the same straw hat that we would go on to see grace Luffy's monkey head in the modern day. That hat came from Shanks, which came from Roger, and so Roger must have gotten it from someone else as well. And then reason number, the other one, even at the beginning of his journey, Roger knew a hell of a lot more than we do. For example, upon his initial meeting with Silver's Rayleigh, Roger stated that their meeting was fate and that they were going to turn the world upside down together, which is a very specific phrase that was also used as part of Whitebeard's final words. He stated that when the One Piece was found, the whole world will be turned upside down, thus fulfilling the goal that Roger had apparently had since the very beginning of his own personal romance dawn. And then there's a line from chapter 966, which has gone very much under the radar, where Roger is trying to seduce Kozuki Oden to accompany him, and he says this about their destination. The stories say that a vast treasure awaits on the final island, and the government says don't go there. That only makes the stories about treasure more believable. And let's be clear, Roger is not talking about Lodestar Island here. He's already been there. It's the final island in the New World that's accessible via a log pose. Instead, here Roger is referring to stories that have been told about the islands that would go on to be named Laugh Tale. And how insane is that? The fact that during Roger's lifetime, there were still people who knew enough about the legendary island to tell stories about it. They may not have known anything about Joy Boy and the Void Century, but somehow knowledge of Laugh Tale and its great treasure made its way to Roger. So there must have been at least one person who sparked Roger's interest here, in the same way that Roger would do for the world on a much larger scale via his execution, hoping that the one person who needed to hear this message would, being Luffy. Although funnily enough, Luffy is like the only person who didn't hear that message, and instead Luffy became a pirate because of Shanks, and is seeking the One Piece more or less incidentally in order to fulfill a greater dream and promise to his mentor. Roger wasn't like Luffy though. Roger was not completely oblivious to the greater purpose of his journey. And I believe that's because Roger's mentor comes from a period of history that we currently know even less about than the Void Century, and he was a member of what I refer to as the missing generation. If Roger was alive today, then he would be 77 years old. And we know a ton about his time as part of the legendary generation, which heavily focused on figures like Garp, Whitebeard, and Rocksteady Zebek. At one point, the fate of the planet was decided by this generation. Had Rocksteady Zebek prevailed, then we would be looking at a very different world today. We also know a huge amount about the awkward middle children of the Golden Age generation, which coalesced around the nexus points of Shanks, Big Mom, and Kaido, but also notably includes many of the warlords like Doflamingo, Gecko Moria, and Mihawk. These are our current, mostly washed up middle-aged pirates. They were there for the very start of the Great Age of piracy, but over time most of them crumbled and gave up on their dreams. And of course, the generation we know most about is the worst generation, given that they're the primary focus of One Piece, and the generation that Luffy belongs to. However, the generation that we know least about is the one that came directly before Roger's, which is the missing generation, and the one that would have contained Roger's mentor figure, the previous owner of the Straw Hat. Because right now we have a rather large gap in One Piece world history, because we can actually go back a generation before this one, with characters like Dr. Kureha and Dorian Broggy, but we know so few people in the gap between Kureha's generation and Roger's generation. And up until now, Oda has been keeping this time period deliberately vague. I say up until now because the most prominent character from the missing generation is currently Cloudy Clover, and it was revealed that during his generation, there was a great purge of D-Clan members, a victim of which was Clover's brother. Now, this is a purge that did not exist in any generation after Clover's, indicating that this was a very dark time, but also that something happened to instigate this. And my immediate thought is that almost 100 years ago, the will of D, as it does, caused a storm great enough for the world government to take incredibly drastic measures to eradicate this initial from the planet, perhaps started by Roger's mentor. That, or this was was when Emu discovered the true meaning behind the D name and thus ordered the extermination of everyone with that middle initial. Because either way, it seems those with the D initial were pretty public about it up until around 100 years ago, and it's only recently become taboo enough that D clan members have had to start hiding their names, like Trafalgar Law was told to. But even after figuring that out, there was still one more hidden message in the Straw Hat. There's a lot of times in the series where Luffy is subject to what I would call very convenient fate. He tends to meet just the right person at just the right time to help him out of just the right situation that he can't get out of alone, many of which can be directly attributed to his choice of headwear. The Straw Hat itself isn't necessarily some sort of magical object filled with throbbing willpower of all the people who have worn it, but it is an incredibly strong and very loud signal that the person who is wearing it is someone that you are meant to help. A great example of this is during Reverse Mountain, when Crocus decided to be ever so helpful and gave the crew his only log pose so that they could navigate the Grand Line. Crocus said that it was thanks for helping Laboon, and that's probably partially true as well, but it was mostly for the sake of Roger, as he went on to reveal as the Straw Hats departed. And I want to linger on this a bit because this isn't just some casual choice to make either. This was a huge decision because Crocus is now effectively trapped at Reverse Mountain. He can't navigate anywhere. However, Crocus was happy to confine himself because he knew the meaning of the straw hat that Luffy was wearing. The same hat worn by Shanks, the same hat worn by Roger, and by Joy Boy. All of which Crocus would know as he discovered the truth of the world on Laugh Tale. And look, it wasn't just the hat. It was a combination of Luffy's personality whilst wearing the hat. But the hat gives Luffy some exclusive fate options that other people would not receive. For another example, I also think there's a fantastic chance that Dr. Kureha recognized the hat on Drum Island as well, given that she has a history with Roger, and Kureha was ever so helpful in providing the Straw Hats with a world-class reindeer doctor. In a way, I think the Straw Hat functions as a much more global scale version of the X that the crew marked on their arms during Alabasta. It's a signal designed only to be understood by those who know, even if the person wearing it is completely unaware of its meaning, as is the case with Luffy. It also makes it very easy to keep track of Joy Boy's inherited will, because everyone with this straw hat goes on to make a pretty big deal of themselves. Photos get taken and printed in newspapers, bounties, etc. So every previous generation with first-hand experience of whoever wore that hat in their generation knows exactly what they should be looking for. And this even extends to characters like Mihawk. On Baratie, he runs into some random group of nobody pirates, but he sees that there's Straw Hat, and after being suitably impressed by the resolves of both Luffy and Zoro, he immediately encourages them and does his part to push that dawn of the world slightly further. Again, without even necessarily knowing what he's doing. Mihawk probably doesn't have a great, if any, understanding of the will of D and the hidden history of the world, but he does have an understanding of Shanks. That hat meant something to Shanks, therefore Luffy, who is wearing the meaningful hat, also means something to Shanks. And now instantly, without even really needing to do anything, Luffy means something to Mihawk. He has made such a powerful ally through his choice of headwear. And as old as he may seem to us, Roger is actually one of the most recent recipients of the Straw Hat, and a small part of a legion of historical Joy people, another one of which may have been whoever woke up Emmett 200 years ago and caused that big kerfuffle on Marijois. So stay with me here because I'm going to very briefly talk about something that isn't One Piece, but I think it very effectively illustrates where One Piece is going. There's an episode of Doctor Who called Heaven Sent, which features the Doctor trapped in a loop of dying and having a new copy of himself taking the place of the old one, and this continues as it ends up taking over 4 billion years to escape the loop, with each new copy of the Doctor inheriting the work of the previous ones. And there's a point where each Doctor, apart from the final incarnation, realizes that they're going to die, but they do so willingly, knowing that there's hope for the next incarnation. That's what this Straw Hat business reminds me of, just on a much smaller 800-year scale. Working out generations isn't a perfect science, but the span of 800 years would give us somewhere around 40 generations, meaning that historically, it seems very likely that including Luffy, Shanks, and Roger, there have been at least 40 people who have inherited the legacy of this hat, with each of them doing what they can to slowly progress the eventual dawn of the world, and each of them inevitably, tragically coming to the realization that they will not see that dawn in their lifetime, but all dying with a sly smile, knowing that it will come to fruition in the future, knowing that if they just hold on, the morning sun will rise. That last part there is a lyric from Binks' Sake, and in the great words of Goldie Roger himself, inherited will, the flow of time, and the dreams of its people. These are things that cannot be stopped. As long as people continue to pursue the meaning of freedom, these things will never cease to be. That is one of the more iconic One Piece quotes. It very poetically describes the main themes of the series, but it's not poetry at all. This is just Roger literally stating the facts of the matter. Even though the world government have near complete authoritarian domain over the planet, they are powerless to stop this event from coming to fruition because it is the culmination of inherited will, inherited dreams, and the relentlessly powerful flow of time. And if the world can just hold on and keep using each generation to push those dreams, then the morning sun will rise. And whether they realize it or not, and it seems that every generation eventually does, that is what pushes each new owner of the Straw Hat to maximize their impact on history. Which I think is best displayed with Roger in Odin's flashback, when Crocus stated that Roger had at best a year left to live. Roger just laughed and said, "So you see, I've got to make my time left count." And Roger is also very mindful about his own humble place in this grand cycle. One fantastic moment to showcase this is when young Pedro asked to join Roger's crew, and Roger replied, "Listen kid, you're on the waiting list. See, everyone gets their turn, their time to shine. And when it comes around, you can help us." Pedro took this to mean that one day he would actually help Roger himself, but that's not what Roger meant when he used the word us. In this case, Roger was referring to everyone that had come before him, as well as everyone who would come after him as a collective, and that Pedro would one day be able to play a part in assisting them, which he did. Just as Roger said, Pedro got his time to shine quite literally in a very big explosion. But it goes deeper than that, because the will of D at certain points in One Piece almost seems eerily similar to an avatar cycle. This is rarely brought up, but there is a concept in One Piece known as the voices of the past. These voices were the focus of the scholars of Ohara, with Professor Clover mentioning in chapter 1120 to make sure that these voices of the past would be heard. And just like Roger's quote about will and dreams and time, this is generally assumed to be a lovely metaphor, the voices of the past simply being a recognition of history, evidence that someone once existed. But this one is also surprisingly literal. In fact, it was these voices that managed to guide Roger to Skypiea in order to discover the poneglyph within the Golden Bell of Shandora, a location that not even Enel, one of the greatest observation haki users in the series, could find. And Roger was very clear with what happened here. He said that finding his poneglyph was easy because it was, quote, just packed full of strong voices. And without even being able to read the text himself, he understood the general impression of what was on the poneglyph. Roger said it was a story of great power, and as it turned out, this is the poneglyph that revealed the ancient weapon Poseidon. Roger was given this information because he was able to hear the voices of the past. They were guiding him. At no point was he ever alone during this journey. Roger didn't have the sole responsibility of history on his shoulders. There was a millennia of voices guiding Roger to his ultimate destination. And it's probably no coincidence that Professor Clover, one of the only other people to mention the voices of the past, was also recently revealed to have been a member of the D clan. And it's very possible that Clover had the voice of all things and could hear the same thing that Roger could. Although the voice of all things isn't exclusive to the voices of the past, as mentioned in the name, it allows you to hear all of the things, but these past voices are a particularly helpful aspect of that. And from here, I would ask the following question. Is Luffy the final owner of the Straw Hat? Is he the last link in this millennia-long Straw Hat saga? The trend with the Straw Hat seems to be that it gets given to a character at the dawn of their adventure. Roger had the hat before acquiring even a single crew member, and then he passed it down to Shanks before Roger became a proper big shot, and so Shanks had the hat long before he even decided to form his own pirate crew, and again passed it down before he became an emperor. And it's almost like they did this intentionally, in order to avoid too much focus on the Straw Hat and allow it to continue to provide its hidden meaning. But Luffy doesn't fit with that trend for fairly obvious reasons. Luffy has made the Straw Hat so famous that no one in the world even refers to Luffy by his name. They all call him Straw Hat. So it's going to be pretty impossible to pass this hat on to the next generation with any sort of subtlety. But you could also argue that passing the hat down from here won't even be needed. After the dawn of the world is achieved, then that likely fulfills whatever purpose the hat was created to fill in the first place. But I don't think that will quite be the end. To bring things back to Alabasta, the marks on the arms of the Straw Hat served their purpose and allowed Vivi to stop the Civil War. However, the marks then went on to serve an unintentional and much more endearing purpose of being a mark of friendship. And the same thing could be true of the future of the Straw Hat. Its function is to help put an end to the millennia-long war that Emu has stated still isn't over. But that war will end, and from there the Straw Hat could take on a new meaning, something more suited to peacetime, and even be the beginning of another 1,000-year-long saga of dreams.